In every city, behind the bright lights and crowded streets, there are stories of struggle, resilience, and unexpected kindness. This is one such story, a journey from hunger and despair to hope and transformation. It begins on a cold winter night, with a single act of compassion that would change more than one life. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. The winter of 1932 pressed hard against the streets of New York. It was a season etched in the memory of the city when hunger walked side by side with its people, and the Great Depression stripped families of shelter, work, and dignity. Pavements that once echoed with a rush of opportunity now carried the slow shuffle of the desperate. Beneath the glow of dim street lamps, doorways turned into beds, and hunger became an unspoken companion. It was in the city of contrasts, wealth glimmering behind frosted windows while poverty froze in the open, that a small moment of humanity unfolded. Amelia was one of many who had fallen into the shadows of the Depression. Once the daughter of a tailor and a seamstress, she now found herself without a roof, wandering the edges of Manhattan with nothing but a tattered coat. She was young, no more than 20, but her eyes had aged beyond her years. On this night, as snow drifted through the alleys, she discovered a half-eaten loaf discarded outside a bakery. To her, it was not waste, it was survival. She pressed the bread close, shielding it from the cold wind, a fragile hope of warmth against gnawing hunger. As Amelia settled onto the edge of a stone step, preparing to taste what little fortune she had found, her gaze fell upon a figure across the street. An elderly man sat hunched against the wall, his body wrapped in little more than rags, his hands trembling as he rubbed them together for warmth. His face carried the deep lines of years lived in hardship. The bread in Amelia's hands suddenly felt heavier, its worth measured not only in her survival but in the silent plea etched across the man's tired expression. She hesitated. Hunger twisted inside her, sharp and unforgiving, reminding her of her own frailty. Yet, after a pause, she rose and crossed the street. The old man looked up, startled by his shadow. Without a word, Amelia broke the loaf in two and placed half in his hands. For a moment, the old man's eyes filled with disbelief. She managed a faint smile and whispered word that history would never record. Yet that night they carried the weight of truth. Hunger passes, but kindness stays. The man nodded, too weak to speak, and began to eat slowly. Amelia returned to her step, clutching what remained, her own hunger now softened by the act. It was not sustenance that warmed her, but the quiet dignity of having given when she had nothing left. In the depths of the Depression, such gestures rarely made headlines, yet they stitched together the fragile fabric of humanity. Unseen by Amelia, another pair of eyes had been watching. Parked just beyond the corner, a sleek black automobile idled, its engine whispering in the night. Inside sat a man of sharp features, his coat pressed, his hands gloved, his gaze fixed upon the exchange. He was not a politician, nor a preacher. He was a businessman, one of those who had weathered the financial storm with wealth intact, yet not untouched by its scars. His name was Ethan Carter. From behind the glass, he observed the moment with a silence that carried both curiosity and unease. In the years of the Depression, stories of ruin filled his ledgers. Factories closed, workers dismissed, savings erased. He had witnessed desperation, but rarely kindness born from it. Watching Amelia, he felt the uncomfortable reminder that resilience was not measured in profit, but in compassion. He did not step out to the car that night, nor announce his presence. He simply remained still, as if committing the scene to memory. The streets that winter were filled with many such silent intersections, moments when wealth passed by poverty, often without acknowledgement. Yet sometimes a glance, a gesture, or a quiet act carried the power to alter paths. For Amelia, it was simply another night of survival, her act guided not by foresight but by instinct. For the old man, it was a reprieve from starvation, a reminder that he was not entirely invisible. For Ethan, it was an awakening, though he did not yet recognize its significance. History tells us that the Great Depression was defined by statistics, unemployment rising above 20%, breadlines stretching for blocks, millions displaced. But behind those numbers lived countless unrecorded acts of endurance. A crust of bread shared, a coat passed from one stranger to another, a kind word offered in the cold. These moments rarely found their way into the archives, yet they sustained lives long enough for nations to recover. They reveal the resilience of ordinary people when institutions faltered. Amelia's story, though small in scale, mirrors a dignity found in countless others. She was no heroine celebrated in newspapers, no leader shaping policy. She was one among thousands, facing hunger, loss, and uncertainty. Yet in choosing to share, she embodied a truth larger than her circumstance, that in times of collective despair, survival was not only about holding on, but about holding others up. Ethan's presence in that silent car becomes, in retrospect, a detail worth pausing on. For history often shifts not through grand speeches alone, but through the quiet transformation of individual hearts. In him, wealth met poverty not in confrontation, but in observation. And in that observation lay the seed of change, though the night gave no hint of the harvest it would later bear. As the snow thickened, Amelia drew her coat tighter, the city's cold pressing in once more. The old man across from her finished his bread, his eyes softening with gratitude. The automobile eased away into the darkness, its driver carrying with him an image he would not easily forget. The streets returned to silence, broken only by the wind and the shuffle of unseen footsteps. Yet within that silence, something had shifted, subtle, unrecorded, but real. The Great Depression was a time when millions fell, and few could imagine the years of struggle ahead. But even in those bleakest streets, small acts of grace carved out islands of hope. Amelia's gesture was one such act, a moment when kindness outweighed hunger, when dignity survived despair. It was history not written in books, but carried in memory, whispered in stories of resilience. And it is in those stories, humble and fragile, that the true measure of that era is found. If you're feeling the depth of this story so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Many more powerful stories are waiting for you. The car moved slowly through the drifting snow, its tires hissing against the wet pavement. Inside, Ethan Carter remained silent, his gloved hands resting on the steering wheel. The brief exchange he had witnessed, the homeless young woman sharing her bread with an older stranger, played again in his mind. For years, he had measured success by balance sheets and quarterly gains. Yet that night, success seemed hollow against the quiet dignity of a girl who owned nothing but still chose to give. Ethan was no stranger to hardship. Born in 1894, he had grown up on the rougher edges of Brooklyn, the son of an Irish immigrant dock worker. He remembered nights when his father came home with callous hands and empty pockets, the family surviving on whatever his mother could stretch into a meal. Education had been his escape, a rare scholarship that carried him through Columbia and into the world of finance. By the late 1920s, he had risen quickly, part of a generation intoxicated by speculation and risk. The crash of 1929 had nearly destroyed him, stripping away half of his holdings overnight. But unlike millions who fell into ruin, Ethan's instincts and cautious investments allowed him to survive, and eventually to rebuild. Now, in the depths of the Great Depression, he occupied a rare position, wealthy, secure, yet haunted by the collapse that had scarred a nation. His company provided loans to struggling businesses, though critics accused him of exploiting the desperate. He knew the accusations carried some truth. He also knew that the world of finance did not forgive softness. And yet, watching Amelia share her bread, he felt the sharp contrast between survival built on numbers and survival built on kindness. For a moment, Ethan considered stepping out, speaking to her, offering aid. But pride held him back. Wealthy men were not welcomed on those streets, and charity, if offered openly, could wound as much as it healed. Instead, he instructed his driver to circle back later, leaving a wool blanket and a small parcel of food near the steps where Amelia had sat today. He told no one. It was not a gesture of generosity to be recorded, but a private acknowledgment of the debt he felt toward those who still carried compassion in the bleakest times. In the months that followed the crash, stories of despair filled every corner of the press. Banks shuttered, soup kitchens overflowed, and families once secure found themselves on the pavements. Franklin Roosevelt would later call it a time when the very soul of America seemed under siege. Ethan read those words years later and remembered that winter, the city's spirit worn thin, its future uncertain. The hunger was real, but so was the resilience. Moments like Amelia's proved it. Ethan's own life, though cushioned by wealth, was far from whole. His wife had left him 2 years earlier, unwilling to endure the isolation his work created. Their daughter, Lily, lived with him, But distance remained between them. A child of 8, she was guarded, unsure of her father's affections. At home, Ethan often found himself staring across the dining table at a silence he did not know how to bridge. In the boardroom, he was decisive. In his own home, uncertain. That night in the car, he thought of Lily and wondered what she might learn if she had seen what he had seen, a woman with nothing giving everything. Ethan's journals, preserved after his death, carried few reflections on his personal life. He was not a man of confession. Yet one line from the winter of 1932 offers a glimpse of his thoughts. Wealth shields us from hunger, but not from emptiness. I saw more grace tonight in a stranger's act than in all the ledgers I have signed this year. It was an uncharacteristic note, written in a hand that usually confined itself to figures and schedules. Perhaps it was the first crack in a carefully constructed armor. History tends to remember the Great Depression in sweeping terms, the Dust Bowl, mass unemployment, the New Deal reforms. But it was also lived in moments of quiet observation, a banker pausing at a breadline, a factory owner watching his workers sell furniture to survive, a passerby noticing children with shoes worn through at the soles. Ethan was one among thousands of witnesses whose wealth could not insulate them from the moral weight of what they saw. In these silent recognitions lay the seeds of change, not always immediate, but enduring. Ethan continued his work, attending meetings, negotiating contracts, maintaining the veneer control. Yet the memory of Amelia lingered. Whenever he passed through the Lower East Side, he found his gaze drawn to the alleys, scanning for familiar faces. Once or twice, he believed he spotted her, moving quietly through the crowd, her shoulders hunched against the cold. He never approached. Instead, he carried her image with him, a reminder that poverty was not faceless, that dignity endured even in rags. For Amelia, the act of sharing bread was forgotten as soon as it was done. For Ethan, it became a point of reflection, a mirror he could not ignore. His world had taught him that value was measured in currency. That night suggested otherwise, that perhaps the true measure lay in choices made when nothing was left to give. In time, Ethan would act on that lesson, though he did not yet know it. For now, he remained a silent observer, a man in an expensive car watching life unfold beyond glass and steel. But history often turns on such observers, when the moment arrives for them to step forward. Ethan's turn was approaching. The Great Depression would demand it, Amelia's path would invite it, and his daughter's quiet longing for connection would require it. Until then, the city pressed on. The bread lines grew longer. The shelters overflowed, and the streets, cold and unyielding, carried both despair and unseen acts of grace. The Great Depression did not simply strip people of wealth, it unstitched entire lives. Families once secure in routine awoke to find their futures scattered, like pages torn from a book and carried by the wind. For Amelia, those torn pages began in 1929, when the collapse of Wall Street triggered a chain of losses that reached into her modest world. She had been a promising student then, with a scholarship that carried her through the first year of art school. She painted in borrowed light, sketching the rhythms of city life, streetcars, rooftops, the hum of markets. Her professors had spoken of her promise. But promise is fragile when the world itself begins to unravel. Her mother fell ill in the winter of 1930. Medical bills grew heavy, and her father, already strained by layoffs at the textile mill, drifted further into despair. When the illness claimed her mother, the grief hollowed the family center. Her father, unable to carry the weight, left soon after. "I cannot do this," he had muttered, leaving behind an unfinished letter that Amelia later discovered in the kitchen drawer. Abandoned and without funds, she lost her scholarship. The landlord cleared the small apartment, and what remained of her belongings was sold for rent. By 20, Amelia was one of thousands, an educated young woman with no home, no family, and little more than resilience stitched into her. On the other side of the city, Ethan Carter's trajectory could not have been more different. He had built his fortune cautiously, resisting the fever of speculation that consumed so many in the roaring 20s. While others boasted of easy gains, Ethan invested in industries he believed would endure: manufacturing, modest lending, transportation. When the market collapsed, he bled but did not drown. By 1932, while many of his peers filed for bankruptcy, Ethan remained solvent, even poised to expand. Yet prosperity brought its own isolation. The The more his fortune grew, the further his marriage crumbled. His wife, Margaret, chafed against the long hours and the emotional distance that defined Ethan's rise. Their home, large and ornate, carried a silence that echoed. In 1930, she left, taking little more than her personal belongings and leaving their daughter, Lily, in his care. Ethan provided for the girl materially, education, clothes, security, but emotionally, he faltered. Board meetings and ledgers came easier than lullabies and confidences. He was a man who could command markets but not mend a child's loneliness. The depression deepened the contrast between their worlds. Amelia walked streets where hunger carved lines into faces, where bread lines stretched for blocks. Ethan attended meetings in boardrooms where decisions about loans, mergers, and closures determined the fate of thousands. They did not know one another, yet their lives ran parallel, threads drawn taut by the same era's upheaval. Amelia fought to keep her humanity intact against relentless deprivation. Ethan struggled to reconcile his wealth with the moral cost of watching others fall. Both carried scars invisible to the city around them. In Amelia's case, survival meant adaptation. She learned where discarded food might be found, how to slip unnoticed into church basements when nights grew dangerously cold, how to barter sketches for scraps of bread. Some who saw her drawings, faces of neighbors captured with startling clarity, remarked on her gift. Yet art rarely fed the stomach. For Amelia, the sketchbook became both shield and burden, a fragile reminder of who she had been and who she still hoped to be. Ethan's burden was different. He sat on committees that debated relief funds, aware that every decision meant livelihoods lost or preserved. He knew he was judged for his wealth, seen as part of the very system that had betrayed ordinary citizens. In some respects, the judgment was fair. He had benefited where others suffered. Still, the image of Amelia on that winter night, the girl sharing her bread when she herself had nothing, lingered like a question he could not answer. What did it mean to live well if one lived without compassion? Letters from the era captured this moral confusion. In 1931, a New York priest wrote to a local paper, "I see men who were once masters of finance lining up for soup, and I see the poor sharing what little they have. It is as though dignity has migrated from those with wealth to those with none." Ethan never quoted those words, but they echoed the disquiet he felt. The Depression produced countless Amelias, young, talented, displaced. It produced countless Ethans as well, men with power wrestling with the weight of survival's inequalities. Their paths had brushed once, in silence, but history has a way of weaving threads together until patterns emerge. For now, Amelia clung to her sketchbook and her stubborn will. Ethan clung to his ledgers and his role as provider for a daughter who did not fully know him. Both moved forward unaware that the same city which kept them apart was quietly guiding them toward another meeting. The bread shared on a snowy street had been only the beginning. Fate, in its quiet persistence, would draw them closer, testing the strength of compassion against the endurance of wealth. In reflecting on that winter, historians remind us that the Depression was not only an economic collapse but a cultural turning. Communities learned to value resilience, generosity, and the bonds of shared struggle. Acts of kindness, small and unheralded, became the currency that carried people through. Amelia and Ethan, unknown to each other, were already bound by that truth. Their stories, shaped by loss and survival, were threads waiting to be woven into something larger. The winter of 1933 carried a heaviness that pressed upon New York like a physical weight. Streets lay dusted in snow that quickly turned to slush under the boots of restless crowds. Storefront windows glittered with promises few could afford, while soup kitchens overflowed with men whose collars once bore silk but now sagged in threadbare wool. It was a city balancing between glitter and despair. Amelia moved through it with practiced quiet. Her coat, worn at the elbows, hung loose around her thin frame, yet her step retained a kind of grace, as if poverty had not stripped her entirely of dignity. In her satchel rested her sketchbook, the one constant companion through years of displacement. Each page was filled with faces, tired mothers, laughing children in alleys, men staring blankly into empty cups. To Amelia, these drawings were not just art but a map of survival, a record of those who still mattered in a world that had tried to forget them. That afternoon, hunger gnawed deeper than usual. She had not eaten since dawn, and even then it had been little more than crusts. The church basement she often sought for warmth had closed its doors for repairs, forcing her into the streets. She lingered outside a bakery, the air thick with the fragrance of fresh bread. Her hand drifted to the coin pocket of her dress. 2 nickels, all she had. Enough for nothing more than a stale roll. Still, she stepped inside. The bell above the bakery door chimed softly. Shelves gleamed with loaves, golden and inviting. Behind the counter, the baker, a stout man with kind but weary eyes, glanced at her. "Back again, miss? You will want yesterday's rolls, I reckon." His tone carried neither judgment nor pity, only the blunt kindness of someone who had seen too much of the depression's toll. "Yes," Amelia whispered, sliding her coins forward. He wrapped the roll and handed it to her without another word. She clutched it as though it were treasure. Unbeknownst to her, another man had entered moments after, the tall figure of Ethan Carter. He had come on an errand of simplicity, something he rarely allowed himself amid ledgers and boardrooms. His daughter Lily, now 9, had begged for sweet rolls, and though such indulgences felt oddly trivial in lean times, Ethan had yielded. It was a gesture of fatherhood he seldom had time for. As Ethan waited, his gaze fell on Amelia. Recognition was immediate and unsettling. The girl from the snowy street, the one who had shared bread with an old man when she herself had little. Here she stood, thin and tired, but with eyes that held a light he could not ignore. She did not notice him at first, too intent on unwrapping her single roll. When she did glance up, her expression flickered, wary, defensive, the instinct of someone accustomed to being overlooked or dismissed. Their eyes held for a breath too long. Ethan, uncharacteristically uncertain, broke the silence. "I've seen you before," he said gently. Amelia stiffened. "People see what they want," she replied, her voice low, almost rehearsed. He took a step closer. "No, I remember. You gave away bread on a winter night to a man who was starving." Her fingers tightened around the roll. She had not expected anyone to notice, let alone remember. "That was nothing," she murmured. "Just bread." "Not nothing," Ethan said, more firmly now. "It mattered." The baker, sensing something unspoken, busied himself in the back, leaving them in a fragile pocket of quiet. Outside, the city noise pressed in, horns, shouts, the shuffle of footsteps, but in that moment, the bakery might as well have been a cathedral. Amelia's defenses rose again. "Why should it matter to you? You look well enough fed." Her eyes darted to his coat, well-tailored, his shoes polished. To her, he was another man of means, another reminder of the divide that carved the city into halves. Ethan hesitated. His instinct was to explain, to speak of Lily, of loneliness, of the uneasy fortune he carried. But words felt clumsy. Instead, he said, "Because kindness, especially in these times, is rare, and I think rare things should be remembered." Something in his tone, earnest, almost regretful, softened her suspicion, though not entirely. She nodded once, curtly, and moved toward the door. "Remember all you like," she said, "but remembering doesn't feed anyone." With that, she stepped back into the cold, clutching her roll as if it were both shield and sustenance. Ethan remained where he was, unsettled. For years, he had measured value in profits and losses, in columns of ink on paper. Yet here was a young woman whose single act had pierced him more deeply than any balance sheet. He purchased Lily's sweet rolls, but when he emerged, Amelia was gone, vanished into crowd as if the city had swallowed her whole. Still, the encounter lingered, tugging at him like a thread he could not untie. Later that evening, as he set the sweet rolls before Lily, she smiled with innocent delight. Ethan smiled back, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He saw not the polished silverware of his dining room, but the bakery's dim light, the hunger etched into Amelia's face, the quiet fire in her eyes. And Amelia, huddled in a corner of the public library with her roll half-eaten and her sketchbook open, found her hand moving almost involuntarily. She sketched the tall man in the bakery, the way his gaze had held hers, steady but uncertain. She did not know his name. She only knew he had noticed her, and in noticing, had unsettled the invisibility she had worn like armor. 2 lives, divided by circumstance yet bound by a single encounter. The city moved on, indifferent, but for Amelia and Ethan, the day marked a subtle shift. Fate, once again, had tightened the weave of their stories. The weeks that followed passed like a blur, yet the memory of that bakery encounter refused to leave Ethan's mind. He tried to dismiss it, bury it beneath contracts and boardroom debates, but each time he closed his eyes, Amelia's words returned to him. Remembering doesn't feed anyone. They echoed not as reproach but as truth, sharper than any figure in his ledgers. Ethan had risen from hardship himself. Born to a dockworker's family, he had known the sting of hunger, the humiliation of debt. But success had insulated him, wrapped him in glass towers and chauffeured cars until those early years felt like someone else's story. Amelia had cracked that glass, reminding him of the world he had left behind. One February morning, he instructed his driver to stop near the public library. He had noticed, on more than one occasion, a slim figure slipping through its doors at dusk, carrying little more than a satchel. Sure enough, there she was, Amelia, shoulders hunched against the cold, disappearing into the grand stone building. Ethan followed, not close enough to startle, but enough to see where she went. Inside, the library was hushed, smelling faintly of dust and ink. Amelia had claimed a corner table near a tall window, her sketchbook open before her. The pages overflowed with drawings, children in bread lines, men sleeping on park benches, a mother nursing an infant beneath a broken street lamp. Each line carried tenderness, but also defiance. Ethan lingered behind a shelf, watching. It felt intrusive, yet he could not look away. Then his breath caught. Among the sketches was a face he knew, his own. The bakery scene, rendered in careful strokes, captured his expression with unsettling accuracy, the hesitation in his eyes, the weight of unspoken words. Before he could retreat, Amelia noticed. She closed the book quickly, defensive. "Are you following me?" she demanded, voice low but sharp. Ethan stepped forward, guilt written across his face. Yes. I wanted to understand. Understand what? She challenged. He hesitated, then gestured toward her sketchbook. That. How you see the world. Amelia's jaw tightened. The world doesn't want to be seen. Not like this. But it needs to be, Ethan replied. His voice carried a conviction that surprised even him. These drawings, they remind people what matters. They reminded me. For the first time, she softened, though only slightly. They are just lines on paper. They don't change anything. He shook his head. You're wrong. Once, years ago, I saw a drawing on a flyer posted outside a factory. A child, barefoot, carrying bricks. It was crude, but it struck me. I couldn't forget it. That sketch fueled a campaign I started, one that led to safer conditions for workers. Art changes more than you think. Amelia blinked. And you? You were behind that. Yes, Ethan admitted quietly. It was a long time ago, but I never forgot the power of an image. Silence hung between them, broken only by the rustle of pages from distant tables. Slowly, Amelia reopened her sketchbook and turned it toward him. This is what I see. People like me. People no one notices. Ethan studied the pages, feeling a strange weight in his chest. These were not merely drawings. They were witness. They preserved dignity in places where it had been stripped away. By the winter's end, New York had not grown kinder, but for Amelia, the city no longer felt entirely merciless. Her days still began in the narrow dormitory of a church shelter, but her evenings ended differently now, inside the modest warmth of an art studio Ethan Carter had quietly arranged for her. The studio was nothing extravagant. Bare walls, a single easel, second-hand brushes, and stacks of paper. Yet for Amelia, it was sanctuary, a space where hunger no longer ruled her thoughts, and where each sketch felt like a reclaiming of self. Ethan visited sparingly, always careful not to present himself as a benefactor. He knew pride was delicate, and Amelia's had been tested enough. Instead, he came under the guise of conversation, bringing Lily with him whenever he could. It was Lily who bridged the distance between them. The child would sit cross-legged on the floor, peppering Amelia with questions about colors, about faces in the sketches, about why people in her drawings so often looked sad. Amelia would answer patiently, her voice gentler with the girl than with anyone else. One evening, as Amelia guided Lily's small hand across a page, Ethan lingered by the window. Outside, snow fell in soft veils, blurring the outlines of the city. He thought of his boardroom, of shareholders who measured every choice in dividends and wondered when he had last felt this kind of quiet purpose. His fortune had insulated him from hunger, but Amelia's resilience revealed another kind of wealth, courage in the face of scarcity. It was Lily who spoke what he could not. "Papa," she said suddenly, holding up the sketch Amelia had helped her draw, "she makes people look alive." Ethan toned, saw Amelia's startled expression, and simply nodded. The weeks that followed carried subtle transformations. Amelia's work found its way into community exhibitions, small gatherings arranged by the church. Visitors paused before her portraits, faces lined with hardship yet lit by dignity. One man murmured, "She paints us as if we still matter." It was the kind of recognition Amelia had long believed impossible. Yet she never forgot the old man she had first shared bread with. His name, she later learned, was Samuel. Ethan ensured Samuel found work as a night watchman, a task light enough for his years but steady enough to restore his sense of worth. When Amelia visited him, Samuel repeated words he had spoken that night in the snow. "Hunger passes, but kindness stays." He smiled as he said it, as though those words had been a lantern through his darkest hours. By spring, Ethan faced a decision of his own. His advisers pressed him to relocate the company's headquarters, to retreat from the city's unrest. But Ethan hesitated. He thought of Amelia's sketches, of Samuel's gratitude, of Lily's laughter in the studio. Prosperity, he realized, meant little if it stood apart from humanity. At a shareholder meeting, his voice carried an unfamiliar conviction. "We remain," he declared, "because leaving would mean forgetting those who built this city with their hands, their backs, and their hunger." Not all agreed, but the choice was made. Ethan returned to his office afterward, feeling something he had not in years, certainty born not of profit but of principle. For Amelia, the change was quieter but no less profound. She had a roof, a studio, and enough to eat. Yet more than that, she had regained her place in the world's gaze. No longer invisible, she now created images that compelled others to see. She often recalled her first wary conversation with Ethan in the bakery. "Remembering doesn't feed anyone," she had told him. Perhaps it was true. But memory, she now understood, could plant the seed of action. On a spring evening, Amelia, Ethan, Lily, and Samuel gathered for dinner in the studio. The table was plain. Bread, stew, a single candle, but the air carried warmth that reached beyond the food. Lily insisted on a toast, raising her glass of milk. "To kindness," she declared. The adults exchanged glances, each touched in their own way by the child's simplicity. Ethan's gaze rested on Amelia. For a moment, words seemed unnecessary. She had given him more than she knew, a reminder that wealth was measured not in ledgers but in the lives one touched. Amelia, in turn, had been given space to rise from shadows into light. The city outside still bustled with hardship and noise, yet within that modest room there was proof of something enduring. A girl who had once been hungry and unseen had reshaped not only her own life but the conscience of a man who held power. An old man, once forgotten, now lived with dignity, and a child carried forward a lesson that a single act of compassion could ripple further than anyone imagined. History seldom records such moments. Newspapers chronicled markets, strikes, elections, but not the quiet evening when four unlikely companions shared bread and hope. Yet in its smallness, the moment revealed something larger, that even in an age defined by scarcity, humanity could be reclaimed. "Hunger passes," Amelia whispered, almost to herself, echoing her words from that first night. Her eyes lifted, meeting Ethan's. "But kindness stays." The candle flickered, its light steady against the gathering dusk. Outside, New York remained restless, but within the studio, shadows gave way to something brighter. Your like and follow motivate me to share more stories. Leave your feedback in the comments.